Welcome to Dark Truth Stories. Before we dive into today's story, we have a humble request. Please consider subscribing to this new channel. Help us hit our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers. Your support will motivate us to keep bringing you more exclusive original cheating wife stories. And now let's get started with today's story. I never imagined that one day my own daughter, my dearest, my last thread of hope, would look me in the eye and say, "It's your fault Mom cheated on you." In that moment, it felt like someone had dropped a boulder right in the middle of my chest. So heavy, I could barely breathe. I just stood there, frozen, like a lifeless statue. My 18-year-old daughter Claire, the same little girl who once held my finger to walk, had just become the reason I felt shattered. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes, not a single tear. Her words carried no shame, no remorse, only a bitterness that sliced straight through me. Rachel, my wife, my partner, the only love of my life, who never once let me feel small in 15 years of marriage. Now her betrayal echoed through my daughter's voice. I said nothing. Words were pointless in that moment. The photos on the wall seemed to mock me. Our wedding picture, where Rachel held my hand and said, "I'll always be with you." Claire's childhood memories, picnics, birthdays, her first day at school. And now, this day. I didn't eat that night. I simply walked into my room and sat in silence. I didn't need light. There was nothing left in my world worth illuminating. Outside the window, snow was falling. Softly, slowly, like a blanket of mourning being laid across my life. Claire's words echoed in my mind. "It's your fault." Was it really my fault? I was the husband who gave Rachel her desires before she even had to ask. I was the father who watered Claire's dreams with my own sleepless nights. And yet, I was the one being blamed? I tried to reason with myself, to make peace with the confusion. But another thought crept in, shaking my soul. Was Claire just my daughter? Or was she Rachel's witness? That night when she said those words, there wasn't just anger in her voice. There was certainty, knowledge, as if she knew exactly what happened and when it happened. And that's when a seed was planted inside me, of suspicion, of truth, and of a revenge not born out of spite, but of justice. In my hands that night, I held Claire's college tuition file. The deadline was the next day. Payment was crucial. But now? Should I invest in the future of a daughter who had already rewritten my past? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with my eyes wide open. Rachel wasn't in the room. Maybe she was with Claire. Or maybe with someone else. I finally understood that nothing would ever be the same again. Not my home, not my relationship, not my heart. I would no longer be the Ethan who only gave, who only endured, who only broke. I would become the Ethan who would face the truth with his own eyes, no matter how horrifying it might be. And as the first light of morning crept through my closed curtains, I took a deep breath, like a new man being born from the ashes. The next morning, as sunlight spilled gently into the room through the drapes, I pulled out the folder that held Claire's college payment documents. It lay exactly where I always kept it, meticulously filed, always ready without hesitation, without question, because it was my responsibility. But today, that paper carried a weight far heavier than dollars. It carried the last breath of trust. I opened my laptop, logged in, and navigated to the college portal. The cursor hovered over the Proceed to Payment button. My fingers trembled, but my heart was still, ready for a decision it had never made before. In 1 second, I didn't click Proceed. I clicked Cancel Authorization instead. And when the screen flashed Transaction Canceled, a strange silence filled the room, as if even the walls couldn't believe what I'd just done. Claire came downstairs. Her hair was messy, a coffee mug in hand, her face that of any carefree college girl, free, distracted, living in her own world. But now that world felt like a lie to me, as if every smile hid a scheme. She asked, "Dad, you paid the fees, right? Today's the deadline." I looked into her eyes, deeply, and in a tone cold as ice, I said, "No." She didn't look surprised. In fact, it was almost like she already knew. She just said, "Why?" I didn't answer. I simply looked at her. Looked at her the way a father tries to find pieces of his wife in his daughter's face. She asked again, "Is it because of what I said yesterday?" I replied quietly, "No, Claire. It's because now I want the truth. About everything." The color drained from her face. She wasn't just surprised. She was shaken. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. For a few seconds, she just stood there, then suddenly turned and rushed toward her room. I knew this wasn't just about a payment. It was a message. To Claire, to Rachel, and to the lie I'd believed was my life for all these years. Rachel wasn't home at the time. She hadn't been, not really, for months. Late arrivals, sudden business trips, spontaneous meetings. It had become more than just suspicion. And now I didn't want doubts. I needed evidence. I went back to my computer and dug through old files. There was a time Rachel's phone used to sync with my laptop. It was a habit from when we trusted each other. I had worked in IT long enough to know deleted data doesn't just vanish. I began pulling from her iCloud backups. Every call log, every location ping, every message. I retrieved them one by one. And just then, Claire came back. Her eyes burned with anger, but there was something else too. Fear, something she was desperately trying to hide. "You can't do this to me," she said. "I'm your daughter." I looked at her, and for the first time, I spoke with firmness. "And I'm your father, a father who's been lied to. You told me it was my fault. Now I want to know, whose fault is it really?" Claire didn't say a word. Her eyes welled up, but the tears refused to fall, as if she knew that once a tear dropped, the truth would become undeniable. She shut the door, and I turned back to the screen. Rachel's life was unraveling before me, slowly, but mercilessly. And deep inside, a question started forming. Was Claire just a daughter? Or had she become a pawn in Rachel's game, blinding me to the truth right in front of my eyes? Sometimes the walls of a home bear witness. They watch, they listen, and one day they reveal the truth through their silent cracks. Truths no voice can speak. That evening, when Claire's footsteps echoed through the house like whispers of guilt, I knew the time had come. To ask questions, and to finally hear the answers that might shatter me, but would not let the illusion survive. I knocked on her door. After a moment, Claire opened it. Her eyes were red, maybe from sleep, maybe from tears, or maybe from everything she had never dared to say. I asked softly, "Can we talk?" She nodded reluctantly, but there was something in her that couldn't stop herself from sitting down. We both sat on the little couch in her room, the same one where I used to read her fairy tales. And now I was here for the truth, the one no bedtime story had ever prepared us for. Without preamble, I asked, "Claire, how long has this been going on?" Her head dropped. Her fingers tangled together like the truth was slipping right through them. I asked again, "Did you know that your mom was with someone else?" Claire slowly lifted her head, but her eyes didn't meet mine. They stared blankly at an empty spot on the wall. "Yes," she whispered. So soft, it was as if the word had scraped its way out. My breath caught. "Since when?" My voice was trembling. "Maybe for about a year." I stayed silent. A sharp pang rose inside me. like ice was suddenly flooding through my veins. Claire's voice trembled as she continued. I saw them once, at Daniel's house. I thought it was just a client meeting, but when I saw Mom say goodbye to him at the door, something felt off. Daniel. That name hit me like salt on an open wound. My oldest friend, my business partner, and now, possibly part of the reason my family was falling apart. Why didn't you tell me? My voice was low, but filled with that hollow emptiness only betrayal leaves behind. Claire looked into my eyes, for the first time, without flinching. Because I thought, you already knew. Like you were watching everything but saying nothing. Like you had already lost Mom. Like you'd given up. I buried my face in my hands. That one moment was the longest of my life. And then one day, Claire said, I saw Mom smiling with Daniel, and I didn't feel angry. I felt scared. I wondered, is Dad really so weak that he sees everything and still does nothing? Her words pierced through me like arrows, each one finding its mark. Claire continued, and that's when I said it. It's your fault. Because if you stayed silent, then you were just as responsible. I looked at her. There was no rebellion left, only regret. But now, I asked, now who are you with? The mother who lied or the father who broke but stood up for the truth? Tears welled up in Claire's eyes. This time, they weren't just emotion, they were testimony. I don't know, Dad. I'm confused. I love Mom, but I've never seen you like this before. You canceled my tuition, and for the first time, I felt like you saw me not as a daughter, but as someone who had to face the truth. I placed my hand over hers. Claire, I don't want to lose you, but I've been losing myself. We sat in silence for a while. Then I said, we have to live with the truth now, even if it shatters the world we built for ourselves. Claire lowered her head, and for the first time rested it on my shoulder, as if a daughter was finally beginning to understand her father's pain. Rachel's smile still looked the same as it used to, but Ethan's eyes had now learned how to read betrayal. That smile no longer felt sweet. It tasted like poison. That evening when Rachel returned home, she opened the door like always, hung her coat, and walked into the kitchen to open the fridge, as if nothing had changed. But Ethan knew. Everything had. He quietly opened the backup folder on his laptop, the same one he had set up years ago when Rachel asked him to help her get over her fear of technology. That same folder had now become a dark mirror, exposing every lie his wife had ever told. He stared at the screen, eyes scanning every message, every call log, every photo. There was Rachel's smile, the one he hadn't seen in years. But now it was for someone else, for Daniel. The same Daniel with whom Ethan had laid the foundation of his very first project. The same Daniel whose wife's funeral Ethan had carried on his shoulders. The same Daniel whose son's school tuition Ethan had quietly paid when the business was sinking. Now that same Daniel was on Rachel's lips, in her arms, and traced in the location history of her phone every single evening. Ethan stared at the address on the screen. 234 East Weiler Street. Daniel's personal apartment. The same place Rachel had claimed as late-night office meetings 4 different times. And now, a CCTV footage just outside that apartment. Rachel and Daniel, lost in each other's eyes, closing the door behind them. Ethan's entire body trembled, but not a flicker of emotion crossed his face. Claire was home at the time, upstairs in her room, maybe studying, maybe trying to convince herself of something else. But Ethan didn't just want the truth from Rachel anymore. He wanted it from Claire, too. Silently, he picked up his phone and activated every tool he had. Call recordings, data recovery apps, everything. That night, Rachel only had a salad for dinner. Ethan didn't say a single word. But when Rachel went to bed and turned over in her sleep, Ethan was still seated in front of his laptop, and the tears in his eyes had long dried up. The next morning, when Claire came downstairs, Ethan stopped her. No prelude, no drama. He simply turned the laptop screen toward her. Rachel and Daniel, together, laughing, hugging. Then an audio message. He's clueless. He still brings me flowers. Poor guy. And another. Claire doesn't know. She thinks I'm working late, but she'll understand someday. Claire said nothing. Her face turned pale, as if her heartbeat had skipped for a moment. Ethan looked at her, not with anger, not with fear, but in quiet anticipation of the truth. Claire asked in a trembling voice, "How long has this been going on?" Ethan said, "It's been going on for so long I've lost track of time." Claire covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes filled with tears, not just of sorrow, but of a strange kind of shame, a weight she'd carried all this time, only to realize now that the burden was never hers to bear. Softly, she said, "I saw Mom going to Daniel's place many times, but I thought it was for work. Sometimes I even dropped her off there myself." Ethan didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on Rachel now, and his breath was heavy, like a man preparing for war. Daniel wasn't just an affair anymore. He was now a name that would be written across every chapter of Ethan's life in blood. Rachel was still sleeping, but Ethan's sleep was over, forever. Rachel still woke up every morning like nothing had happened. Wrapped in a bathrobe, hair slightly tangled, coffee cup in hand. She placed toast on Claire's plate, said without meeting Ethan's eyes, "Today I have a strategy call at Daniel's office. Might run late." That day, for the first time, she didn't finish her coffee, and Ethan's gaze paused on her trembling fingers. Ethan wasn't looking at Rachel anymore. He was staring past her, at Daniel, the man who had stabbed him in the back with a silent blade. That day, Ethan didn't go to his office. He drove straight to Brooklyn and parked in front of the building where Daniel lived. 234 East Weiler Street, the same address that now pulsed through Ethan's veins like venom. He parked on a corner, put on a hat and glasses, and pretended to pick up a package at the building's front desk, the same place Daniel received something new almost every day. The receptionist handed over the signature log without hesitation. Ethan scanned it quickly, and there it was. Claire's name, twice. Last month. Both times with Rachel. His throat went dry. Claire had been to Daniel's apartment, with Rachel. Maybe Rachel had even taken her inside. Maybe Claire had seen it, heard it, felt it, and still said nothing. Ethan scanned that page into his phone and immediately called his attorney, Michael Green, who had handled all of Ethan's corporate legal affairs for over a decade. "Michael." His voice was sharp, cold. "I need full documentation of ownership on our company shares. Rachel and Daniel, how much do they hold combined?" There was a pause. Then Michael said, Ethan, is something wrong?" "Just do it," Ethan said firmly, "and schedule a board meeting for Monday." This wasn't just about a broken marriage anymore. This was about taking back his entire life. Rachel and Daniel had slowly siphoned off key clients from the company, without Ethan's knowledge. And now that Ethan had all the evidence, he was ready to flip the game exactly where it began. That night when Rachel returned home, Ethan looked at her and asked for the first time in weeks, "Where's Claire?" Rachel looked slightly startled but replied, "She's out with friends, I think." "Why?" Ethan studied her face carefully, then smiled faintly. "Because tomorrow morning I'm taking her somewhere." Rachel's lips twitched. She could sense something was changing. The next day, Ethan took Claire to a quiet park, one where he used to teach her how to ride a bike. As soon as they sat down, he asked, "Why didn't you tell me you went to Daniel's place with your mom?" Claire froze. "How did you—" Ethan cut her off. "That doesn't matter now. What matters is, you saw them together, didn't you?" Claire stayed silent for a long moment. Then her eyes welled up, and in a whisper, she said, "Yes." "Did you hear anything?" Claire's voice trembled. "One day, Mom told me to wait outside, said it was just a business meeting. But I could hear laughter from inside. And once, I saw her hug Daniel. I got scared." Ethan looked at her gently. "Claire, do you trust me now?" Claire nodded. "Yes, Dad, I do now." Ethan took a deep breath. "Because now, it's war." Claire reached for his hand and gripped it tightly, for the first time with strength. And Ethan knew in that moment, he wasn't alone anymore. Now he had a witness, a daughter who stood beside the truth. Rachel hadn't just betrayed her husband. She had conspired to take over Ethan's company, his daughter, and his life. Now it was time to bring that entire conspiracy crashing down on her head. Claire climbed the courthouse steps, holding tightly onto Ethan's hand, like she was anchoring herself to him, shielding herself from the storm of past sins. Ethan gently squeezed her fingers, a silent signal that everything was about to be exposed. No more lies hiding in the shadows. Rachel sat across the courtroom beside Daniel. White blouse, pearl earrings, and that same smile that once made Ethan fall in love. But today, that smile cut through him like a knife. Daniel looked calm, but the unease in his eyes was unmistakable. The kind only worn by men whose secrets are moments away from being laid bare. The judge read the case name aloud. Ethan Wills versus Rachel Wills and Daniel Harper on grounds of marital fraud, corporate conspiracy, and custodial manipulation. The courtroom seemed to forget how to breathe for a second. Ethan's attorney, Michael Green, stood up. In his hands was a thick folder stuffed with evidence. One by one, he laid everything before the court. Rachel and Daniel's text messages, GPS location logs, client redirection data, and video footage of the board meeting where Rachel quietly transferred Ethan's clients into her name. "Your Honor," Michael began, his voice steady and strong, "this isn't just infidelity. This is theft, a meticulously crafted conspiracy to erase Mr. Wills from his own family, his own company, and even from the trust of his only daughter." Rachel didn't react. She sat there, decorated, composed, but hollowed out from the inside. Ethan didn't look at her once. His entire focus was on Claire, who was now walking up to testify. The judge asked, "Miss Claire Wills, do you understand what you're about to do?" Claire nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then proceed." Her throat was dry, but her voice didn't waver. "I saw my mother with Mr. Daniel Harper many times," she said clearly. "I learned how to lie, because my mom told me some things should never be told to Dad. I doubted her, but I stayed silent, because I thought maybe Dad was the reason this family broke." Ethan held his breath. Claire paused for a moment, then continued. "But now I understand. I took out my anger on my dad because it was easier than facing the truth. I started believing that if I didn't stand by my mom, I'd be the bad one. But the truth is, she's the one who showed me the wrong path." Rachel's eyes lifted toward Claire, with a strange shiver behind them. Claire's eyes now welled with tears. "I blamed my father because I couldn't accept that my mother is a liar." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The judge quietly turned through the documents. Then he said, "Based on the evidence provided and the testimony given, the court grants Mr. Ethan Wills primary custody of Claire Wills, declares Mrs. Rachel Wills guilty of corporate conspiracy, and awards Mr. Wills controlling ownership of Wills Tech Enterprises." Rachel's face lost all color. Daniel couldn't sit upright in his chair. The dream they had built of victory had just collapsed within the cold walls of a courtroom. Ethan didn't smile. He didn't bask in victory. He simply looked at Claire and held her hand tightly. Outside the courthouse that day, Ethan walked up to Rachel and said, "I loved you, Rachel, but you only used me. What you lost today wasn't taken by me. Your lies took it from you. Rachel didn't reply. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Claire stayed close to Ethan's shoulder, as if she had returned to the fortress where her dreams were once safe. Justice had been served. But would the wounds ever heal? Claire's silence had become the loudest scream Ethan had ever heard. After returning from court, he kept looking at her, as if trying to piece together a word that had lost its meaning. Rachel and Daniel's conspiracy was exposed, but Claire's face still lingered like an unfinished battle in Ethan's eyes. On the way home, Claire stared out the car window, searching for a path that might somehow lead her back into her father's heart. But Ethan said nothing. He didn't know how a father was supposed to hug his daughter when her eyes still carried the woman who broke him. At the dining table, they sat across from each other, but the plates remained empty. As Ethan poured a glass of water, he asked, "Are you okay?" Claire nodded, but no words came out. That night, Claire came out of her room holding an old photo album, the one filled with pictures from her childhood, with Rachel. She gently flipped through the pages. Her first birthday, swinging in the park, and in between them, Ethan's smile. Claire spoke in a soft voice. "I misunderstood you, Dad. And the worst part is that I kept believing my mother's lies, thinking I was right." Ethan held her hand. His eyes welled up, but his voice was steady. "You were young, Claire, but your heart was never weak. You proved yourself by standing on the side of the truth." Claire's eyes had finally opened. She had freed herself from Rachel's words. But inside there was still a fear that only Ethan could understand. Claire asked, "Do you still love me?" Ethan smiled and kissed her forehead. "More than I've ever loved anyone." That was the first night Claire fell asleep with her head resting on her father's shoulder. But Rachel's downfall didn't end there. A week later, when Claire returned from school, she saw someone standing outside the house. Rachel. Her hair was messy, her eyes looked tired, and she held an envelope in her hand. Ethan opened the door. Rachel didn't make eye contact. She just handed him the envelope. "This is for Claire," she said. Ethan didn't invite her in. Claire stood at the door. She took the envelope, opened it, and began to read. "Claire, your mother has made mistakes. Big ones. I betrayed your father. I betrayed you too. But I never wanted either of you to hate me. I was only fighting my loneliness, and in doing so, I lost everything. If you can ever forgive me, I'll still be where I always was, right behind you." Claire read the letter, and then tore it apart. She said, "I'm learning to forgive, but I don't want to forget." Rachel walked away. That night, Ethan and Claire had dinner together for the first time, with laughter, light-hearted jokes, and new dreams. Claire was no longer just Ethan's daughter. She had become the strongest pillar of his trust. Rachel and Daniel had lost in court, but Claire had won something far greater, herself. Even though Claire had managed to piece herself back together inside her home, the world still chose to define her by her mother's name. Walking through the halls of school, Claire felt the weight of every stare, some filled with pity, others with cruel smirks. As she passed one group, someone whispered, "Look, that's the girl whose mom left her dad." Claire didn't say a word. She just brushed her hair back and kept walking, but something inside her began to crack. Ethan noticed Claire's silence on the drive home. After dinner, he gently knocked on her door. "May I come in?" Claire nodded with a faint smile. In her hands was that same torn letter from Rachel, now pieced back together as she tried to read it again. Maybe just to understand how someone could ask for forgiveness so shamelessly. Ethan sat beside her and said, "You know, when I was your age, I was embarrassed by some of my dad's decisions too. But now I realize everyone makes mistakes. The difference is, some hide them and some own them." Claire's eyes welled up. "But Dad, everyone looks at me like I'm some broken story." Ethan held her hand. They don't know your story. They only know the headlines. You've got to show them the truth, not with words, but with your strength. The next day, Claire went to school, but this time, her head wasn't bowed. She walked straight into the principal's office and said, "I want to speak at the next student assembly." The principal was surprised, but the fire in Claire's eyes left no room for debate. A week later, the entire school gathered in the auditorium. Claire stood on the stage, no notes in her hands, but everything she had buried inside reflected clearly in her eyes. "Hi, I'm Claire Wills," she said. "You probably know me from the whispers in the hallway, from the gossip that travels faster than truth. Yes, my mother cheated on my father. Yes, it shattered our home. But what you don't know is, my father stood strong, and I learned that real strength isn't about fighting. It's about never giving up." The entire hall fell silent. Claire took a deep breath. And if you're someone who's ever been mocked for your scars, remember this: scars are proof that you survived. For a moment, there was stillness. Then came the slow applause. And soon, the entire hall erupted. Claire looked down at Ethan. He was there too, sitting at the very back, but his eyes carried the shine every father dreams of seeing in their child. That night, Claire and Ethan ordered pizza, curled up on the couch, and watched a movie together. And Ethan realized Claire was no longer a child. She was a warrior. The case of Rachel and Daniel was now making waves in the media. Their disgrace had spilled into the public eye. Ethan never gave an interview, but when a reporter asked, "How did you survive the betrayal?" he simply looked at Claire and said, "Because she chose truth over comfort." Claire still went quiet sometimes, but Ethan now understood. That silence wasn't fear anymore. It was strength in the making. Rachel emailed Claire once again, just one line this time. "I saw your speech. I'm proud of you." Claire deleted the email. She didn't reply. Because some relationships don't end with answers. They end with silence. From then on, Ethan and Claire started exploring new places every weekend. Sometimes old bookstores, sometimes long drives, sometimes just sharing tea. All the things they once put off now became a necessary part of every day. Claire wasn't just Ethan's daughter anymore. She was his pride. A story that broke, scattered, rose again, and now taught others that loyalty isn't found in marriage vows. It's found in truth. Time was slowly healing the wounds Claire and Ethan had carried. But some truths don't emerge with time. They require courage. Ethan believed Rachel's face, her lies, her betrayal were all part of a closed chapter. But the story wasn't over. The door was still ajar, and from that crack, another storm from the past was about to enter. One afternoon, while Ethan was digitizing old paperwork in his office, Claire was away at college. As he pulled out a dusty folder from the bottom drawer, he thought he'd scan it like the rest. But the moment he opened it, something inside made his breath catch. A private voicemail transcript under Rachel's name. A report from a data recovery firm. And attached to it, a USB drive with 3 recordings, all dated about 8 months ago. Ethan put on his headphones and played the first message. "Hey, it's me. Don't text me anymore. Ethan almost caught me last night. Claire's starting to ask questions. We need to stop until I figure something out. Maybe I'll push for that separation idea you suggested. Let's just keep it low." The voice was Rachel's, and the intent behind her words was more venomous than any act of betrayal. In the second recording, Daniel spoke. "I'm telling you, the shares won't move unless he signs them off. Maybe you need to give him a reason to walk away. Make him believe it's his decision." The third recording made Ethan's hands tremble. It was Rachel again, her voice soft, tired, but unmistakably clear. "I don't love him anymore. Honestly, I don't think I ever did. He was just the right man at the right time. Safe. stable. But you were always the fire. Something burned in Ethan's eyes. Not tears, but the dreams he had long watched die. Now they were simply being confirmed. This wasn't a moment of weakness. It wasn't just a reckless affair. It was a calculated, systematic conspiracy to make Ethan feel insecure, isolated, and slowly take over every part of his life. She didn't say a word to Claire. But that evening, a package arrived at Claire's door. From Rachel. Inside was a diary with a note stuck on top. This isn't to ask for forgiveness. It's just the truth I never had the courage to speak out loud. Claire opened the diary and began to read. Each page felt like Rachel's shadow. I married Ethan because I couldn't see another way. Daniel was out of my life at the time, and I was looking for safety. A home where I wouldn't end up like my mother. Claire's fingers trembled. Further down it said, when Daniel came back, I started questioning everything. He was my what if. But I never realized that this what if would cost Claire her innocence and Ethan his soul. Claire came downstairs and placed the diary in front of Ethan. I don't know how to understand this woman, Dad, she said softly. She's my mother, but I don't think she ever tried to understand herself. Ethan closed the diary. Rachel always saw herself as a victim. But the truth is, she made us the victims. Sometimes people dress their lies up so well, they start fearing the face of truth itself. Claire stayed silent. But for the first time, Ethan saw his daughter was no longer lost in illusions. She wasn't seeing Rachel as her mother anymore, but just another person. Someone who had shaken the very foundation of love for her own selfish desires. Rachel made one final attempt. An email to Ethan. It read, I don't ask to come back. I just want to know if any part of you ever truly loved me. And if so, does that part still exist? Ethan didn't respond. He left the email unread, just like Rachel's presence in his life now. Unfinished, closed, and no longer worth revisiting. There was just one final turn left. The first light of a cold morning clung to Claire's window, as if life itself was knocking again. Ethan sat on the balcony, warm coffee in hand, eyes carrying the weight of years. Out on the snow-covered lawn, Claire held a toy from her childhood. Her fingers gently wrapped around it as she looked back at Ethan. Her eyes no longer asked questions. They had become the answer. Rachel was now just the past. A name that echoed in memory but no longer knocked on the door. Daniel was in prison. Rachel had faded into a quiet life in a small town. And for the first time, Ethan looked at his calendar. There were no court dates, no custody hearings, just empty days. For himself. Claire returned from college and sat beside him. She had a book in her lap, but her eyes were fixed on Ethan's face. Dad, she asked softly, have you ever thought about being with someone else? Ethan smiled gently. So, this is the talk, huh? Claire shook her head. No, it's just a question. Have you ever wished someone could love you again? But not like Rachel did. In the right way? Ethan stared at the sky for a long while, as if looking for answers in the clouds. Truth is, Claire, I'm learning how to love myself. For years, I only saw myself as a husband and a father. Now I want to discover who Ethan Wills really is. Claire nodded, as if she understood. And you? Ethan asked. Have you forgiven Rachel? Claire paused for a moment, then said, I forgave her the day I realized she was just a broken woman pretending to be whole. But I don't trust her, and maybe I never will. Ethan placed a hand on her back. That's enough. That evening, Ethan pulled out a canvas from the old storage room, one that had remained untouched for years. And for the first time, he painted on it, without fear, without expectation, There was no Rachel on that canvas, no shadow of Daniel. Just a girl, Claire, standing on top of a hill, her hair flying in the wind. And in front of her, a man stood, whose eyes said only one thing: I didn't lose you. I found you. A few weeks later, Claire made a documentary about her story for her college project. The title: It's Your Fault Mom Cheated on You, My Truth. And the final line said, if you can face the truth, the world can't break you, because truth is never alone. It stands with those who choose to fight lies. Ethan watched that line and looked at Claire, and a single quiet tear rolled down his cheek. Not from pain, but from relief. Maybe Rachel had lost everything in life, but Claire had found the truth, and Ethan had finally found himself. Now the question isn't just for Ethan, it's for you too. If something like this happened to you, and your own daughter one day told you, it's your fault mom cheated on you, would you be able to forgive her? Or would her truth always remain a thorn in your heart? Could you learn to live again like Ethan did and embrace the truth? Or would you always live in someone else's shadow?